You could see how this could be applied to, say, the EPA. How like, oh, well, there's a major question about if these fossil fuels are putting things into the air that are making rates of asthma go up, rates of lung cancer go up, rates of premature death go up. Maybe the EPA is gonna have to step in and force you to regulate some of that stuff. Well, under the major questions doctrine, they'll be like, oh, well, our hands are tied. You gotta leave it up to Shell. You gotta leave it up to these fossil fuel companies. None we can do, you know? It has a lot of ramifications to the economy. There's a lot of political contention around it. Our hands are tied. And if this major questions doctrine continues to get precedent in favor of it, and the Supreme Court remains conservative, well, any attempts that a Joe Brandon administration would try to do to make it so that at least the environment doesn't suffer too much, even if the small amount that they might be able to get done, the Supreme Court could just be like, nah, not happening. I'm sorry. And that's the idea. That's the vibe. So tighten your belts, hold on to your anime body pillows, and fly your flags at half-mast, because unfortunately, the Supreme Court is back in session as of like October 2nd or something like that. Of course, these people are really, really busy all the time doing really difficult labor of making decisions to take your rights away. So they need to have so many days off throughout the year all the time. Even though when I was in the food service workforce for the greater part of a decade, I was doing very demanding physical labor. I was moving 60-pound chicken boxes by the dozen every single goddamn day at work, standing on my feet, all this kind of stuff. Doing obviously more physically demanding labor, but I didn't get any guaranteed days off like all this. So something's going on there. They're back in session, and unfortunately for all of us, that means that our ability to live a good life hangs in the balance. It's already kind of guaranteed that the odds are against you in that regard, but it can get worse. In fact, it is the project of one of two major parties in this country to actively make it worse. So remember back in the day, 6 months ago, I made this video, Republicans losing the youth has them panicking. And it was outlining how they wanted to do a variety of things to stop specifically the youth from being able to vote, because they understood as demographic trends and voter trends go, the younger generations that are now aging into being able to vote are becoming more and more progressive with time, bucking an older trend where people would tend to get more conservative as they got older. It's actually the opposite in the States. The older you get, the more lefty you're getting as a millennial, not even to mention the Zoomers. And they also understand that their very reliable voter demographic, the elderly, the boomers, are aging out, should we say, of being able to reliably vote for them. And Republican inaction on our massive public health event way back in, what was it, March of 2019 or 2020, one of those two, right? A lot of their voters kind of kicked the can because of that, because of Republican inaction on the issue, who would have been saved if, you know, what the Democrats, for all their faults, wanted to do actually was able to happen. So that's cool. Though, to be fair, the Democrat response for it was actually not as good as either. But I mean, shit ain't easy. And within this, so obviously this is why you have dumbasses like Vivek Ramaswamy talking about, oh, I want to make it so you can't vote until you're 25 unless you serve in the military or pass some kind of civics test, which the average Republican could not pass in order to be eligible to vote if you're below the age of 25. And that's precisely because Republicans understand that the more people that are voting, the less likely they are to win. The less people are voting, the more likely they are to win. So they have to make sure that the least amount of people can vote as is possible, which is kind of how the country was founded, you know? When the country was founded by the, you know, some of the greatest minds to grace the earth, the founding fathers, only rich, white, land-owning men were allowed to vote. Now, of course, eventually that was changed, but for all you poor whites out there, you know, you kind of got that smoke too, unfortunately. You weren't allowed to vote. You weren't allowed to have a say in the decisions that your representatives make in your name. And Paul Weyrich, who was a massive figurehead in the Republican Party back, I think, in like the 60s, literally is on videotape saying that he does not want as many people as possible to vote. In fact, he wants the opposite. And obviously the implication being because that's the only way Republicans can win. This is why Donald Trump was very much against mail-in ballots and all this kind of stuff. But there's other ways as well. I've also talked about how the Republican Party and the conservative project broadly wanted to use the Supreme Court, the third branch of the government, the other two being the legislature and the executive branch. They wanted to use the judicial branch in order to essentially legislate from the bench because they understand that they are not likely to win popular elections anymore, right? And none of this is old news either. The amount of gerrymandering that one Texas district literally looked like Onyx from Pokemon, though that has since been changed. There are a variety of others still in effect to this day, where they specifically carve out certain districts when they draw maps that guarantee that all of the Democrat voters in the state, or the people who are likely to vote Democrat, are localized in a single district, and then they make sure every other district gets them to a majority of voters voting for Republicans so that they can win state elections. That's called gerrymandering. They also voter suppress by closing voting stations, by, advocating for voter ID laws, even though they're pretty unnecessary in this country. And in fact, a lot of the times that we're actually seeing voter fraud happen, it's done by Republicans. It's a completely unnecessary measure because a lot of the time, you're already recorded in the government. They have your social security number attached to your name and all this kind of shit. It's just a way to make it so that if you are in a demographic that has difficulty getting access to an ID, it makes it less likely you're able to vote. There's no evidence that it actually helps the security of elections at all. On top of all of that, they also want now to control the judicial branch. And they're able to do this because of those other efforts that I already mentioned, right? If it is the case that our Supreme Court justices and any other, circuit court judges are not directly elected by the people voting directly for them, like you would say for Joe Brandon or Donald Trump in the 2024 general election, well, then they are kind of democratically elected by being nominated by the representatives that people do end up voting into office, right? Like Joe Brandon or Donald Trump. Now, the problem with that idea is that they're not actually democratically elected, not only because it's not like a direct election by the people casting a ballot for Brett Kavanaugh or whatever, but if the democratic nature of those nominations is predicated on the democratic nature of the representatives that got voted into office, well, if Republicans are already gerrymandering and voter suppressing and fucking with elections so much that they are guaranteed to win and Democrats can't, that's not a democratic process. And therefore, any appointments made from that are not democratically made. Obviously, this can be more nebulous. Like if you have a state that has really good voter protections and voter enfranchisement, and they nominate a specific judge, and after voting for it, they're obviously in an ideal system, it would be like that. But currently it's not. And the reason why it's not is because the Republican Party has been working overtime to make sure it's not. There's a historical trend for this. And you see this happen with Donald Trump's first term and hopefully only term in the presidency, in the executive branch. Before him, during the Obama term, they wanted to get Merrick Garland in the Supreme Court because Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. Ruth Conda forever. Rest in piss. He should have fucking retired a lot earlier in Obama's term, so the Republicans had less of an argument. And even if it wasn't that late, Republicans probably still would have made the argument, because the general election's coming up, new president's coming in, you can't have the Supreme Court nomination because you gotta wait, even though it's not a rule. There's nothing saying that that's the case. They essentially just stole a Supreme Court seat. And then Donald Trump ends up winning, even though he lost a popular vote, through the participation trophy of the Electoral College, which fundamentally makes our federal elections, nationwide elections for the presidency not democratic, because the amount of people in this country that are contained within California is the amount of people that are contained within 18 states in the Midwest, but they all get the same amount of proportional voting because of the Electoral College, because of how the Senate works. It's a whole bunch of, shit. It's not democratic, so our Supreme Court justices and other justices are not democratically elected either, really, are they? And now you've got a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court that has overturned Roe v. Wade, that has gestured at wanting to overturn Obergefell, the one that legalized gay marriage during Obama's term. They've thought about overturning laws that make it so that anti-sodomy laws are not allowed, so they essentially would make anti-sodomy laws legal again. And boy, oh boy, are they not done. So a lot of this has been the project of the Federalist Society. I've talked about this on stream before. It's a group of people headed by conservatives, of course, whose specific purpose is to get as many conservative activist judges into court seats as is possible. The idea being, even if you lose the executive branch to Joe Brandon, even if you lose the legislature to either the House or the Senate to the Democrats, but you control at least the House and the Senate as a Republican, and you have a good chance at doing that because of the amounts of election fuckery they get up to through gerrymandering, voter suppression, etc., well then, even if the Republican obstruction in the legislature, somehow a good thing for the people gets through, it doesn't matter because the judges will just say that that law, that legislation is actually not constitutionally viable, is unconstitutional, rule against it, and then even if good legislation somehow gets through to the executive branch, gets signed by Joe Brandon while he's wearing his aviators so that his glowing red eyes don't show, it doesn't matter. Because they could just like, nope, we're actually the unelected grand wizards in our ivory tower, and we have decreed that what we say goes. This has been a consistent project by the Federalist Society, by the Republican Party in this country, and the conservative ideological project in general. This is also how the far right took over Hungary through the judiciary, and obviously a variety of other things. So, all that being said, because the Supreme Court is back in action on the 3rd of October, I believe, according to this, the 30th of October, there's a couple cases that I learned about from this Majority Report interview with Ian Millhiser, who's a Vox correspondent that seems to focus on the Supreme Court, seems to know a bit about it, is also a lawyer, is my understanding. And it's really interesting. Obviously, we'll link it in the description. But yeah, there's a couple cases that they talk about here. And I want to give you a bit of a rundown because even if this is not the most sexy information out there, and I mean, I'm trying my best, it's really important to know because all of the bad shit we're seeing in this country that's been happening and all of the defeatism that people feel when it comes to electoral participation, a lot of that is to do with a lot of these Supreme Court decisions. And it's more shit going on that's going to make it even worse if these things don't go in the good direction when it comes to the rulings. And there's no reason to believe that it will because of the 6-3 makeup of the Supreme Court. You know, if, God forbid, Hillary Rodham Clinton won the Electoral College, which was a big L on her campaign, because a lot of the states that they thought they could literally just carry, like Wisconsin, Michigan, the Blue Wall, and the Rust Belt, ended up going to Donald Trump. If somehow Hillary Rodham Clinton was able to win it, we would at least have center-right to center to maybe even center-left judges on the court in a 6-3 capacity now, which is certainly better than a 6-3 far-right conservative one. Roe v. Wade would still be the law of the land. Gay marriage would not be under threat. All this kind of shit, right? Obviously, a lot of bad shit probably be going on, too. I'm not a big fan of the Democratic Party until we move past the first-past-the-post system, or a proportional voting system is the best we got, unfortunately. So, essentially, there are a couple concepts we have to think about here. The one case we're looking at on the Supreme Court docket coming up, one of many, is Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. And that has to do with two different kinds of what they call doctrines or ways of thinking in the Supreme Court. Those being the chevron doctrine and the major questions doctrine. And both of those kinds of ideas are up to have some pretty major changes. If you'll remember, Joe Brandon actually did try a little bit to forgive a bunch of student loans. Maybe not enough, sure. But he tried a little bit using the powers in the executive branch and his administration and the federal agencies that he's in control of to forgive a variety of student loan debt. A lot of you would have a little bit more cash in your pocket if that was actually able to happen. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court overturned that. They said it was not constitutional. You couldn't do it. And because they have so much power, what can you do? You can only try to do other things until those get challenged. And that has to do with the so-called major questions doctrine. That being, if ever there's a decision that could majorly impact an industry, so our economy, or has a large amount of political contention, the major questions doctrine essentially says, well, if it has a major ramification for the economy, or has a lot of political contention around it between the parties, the federal government, the presidential administration can't do anything about it. You can't do that. Has to be left up to individual industries. So in the case of the student loan forgiveness, even if Joe Brandon wants to forgive loans using those federal administrations, well, there's a lot of political contention because the Republicans are making a big stink about it, and it would potentially be damaging to the economy because of the debt holders, even though I don't think that's actually a really good argument, given how the loans are going to be forgiven. But even the political aspect is enough. Well, then you can't do that. It'll be left up to the industry. The industry, in this case, the loaners, don't want it to happen, so then you can't do it. That's the major questions doctrine. Of course, this will never apply to a Republican administration. Obviously not, because this major questions doctrine was actually a thing during Donald Trump's term for 4 years, but it was never brought up once. And you have to remember, this was in the course of an administration that literally tried to ban all Muslims, an entire religious minority, from entering the country. Now, if that's not a major question that has a lot of political contention around it and also has ramifications for our economy in a major way, I don't know what is. But of course, the project here is to legislate from the bench and weaponize the judicial branch because Republicans know that their likelihood of winning the legislative and executive branches are slipping. That's what it is. So that's one. So the last time that happened was when the FDA was trying to regulate tobacco, and the tobacco companies were like, no, 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 you can't do that. So then the Supreme Court was like, yeah, no, our hands are tied, man. The FDA, whose literal job it is to know about what's happening with tobacco, how it's killing people, and, the cigarettes that are being manufactured, it's literally their job to regulate that. We're just going to leave it up to the corporations anyway. You're not allowed to do anything about that. And obviously, we know historically, the tobacco companies have lied over and over and over and over again about how we know that they were aware of the negative health outcomes of cigarettes that they sold, and they suppressed all that information and lied about it so that they could keep making money at the expense of people's lives and health, even people not smoking cigarettes because of secondhand smoke. You could see how this could be applied to, say, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which has been thoroughly gutted by the Donald Trump administration and the Bush administration. But you could see how, there's a major question about if these fossil fuels are putting things into the air that are making rates of asthma go up, rates of lung cancer go up, rates of premature death go up. I know studies have literally shown all of this. Maybe the EPA would be like, okay, well, you're going to have to regulate some of that stuff, or else, the EPA is going to have to step in and force you to do it. Well, under the major questions doctrine, obviously Republicans are not going to like that because they get a lot of money from the fossil fuel companies. So they'll be like, oh, well, because of the major questions doctrine, our hands are tied. We, the grand wizards at the Supreme Court, you gotta leave it up to Shell. You gotta leave it up to these fossil fuel companies. None we can do. It has a lot of ramifications to the economy. There's a lot of political contention around it. Our hands are tied. And then they will continue, the fossil fuel companies. We literally have documented evidence that they knew that the products that they sold, fossil fuel, was going to have devastating effects to our environment. Their own internal studies showed this, but they suppressed the information and lied about it in public, propagandized people, and now we're in climate hell, and it's only getting worse. So now, if this goes through, and if this major questions doctrine continues to get precedent in favor of it, and the Supreme Court remains conservative, well, any attempts that a Joe Brandon administration would try to do to make it so that at least the environment doesn't suffer too much, and the people living in it don't suffer too much, and the animals living in it don't suffer too much, even if the small amount that they might be able to get done, the Supreme Court could just be like, nah, it's not happening. I'm sorry. And that's the idea. That's the vibe. This also has to go with the chevron doctrine, which is what we mentioned before, Chevron obviously being a fossil fuel company, and this one's also a bit interesting. So essentially, the chevron doctrine suggests that in the case of any legislation that is drafted and passed by the legislature, if there is any vague nature to that law, the affected industries are the ones that should be deferred to when it comes to how that law is enforced. Right? The idea there being is because those industries know more about it than, say, a governmental agency or even justices on a court or the elected representatives, right? Because it's literally their job to do all that shit. That's the idea. That also applies to federal agencies, by the way. At least it should. Because, it is literally the job of the EPA to understand, what is damaging to the environment and people's health if it's burned in fossil fuel. What is damaging to people's health when it comes to wastewater management, when it comes to ocean dumping. But they're going to use this idea to be like, oh, well, you got to leave it up to the industry so that, fossil fuel companies can continue to pollute. Because to do otherwise would hurt their bottom line, would hurt their profit margins, and that's not good for them. So if applied to a governmental agency that's meant to regulate things, like the EPA, well, I'm sure the EPA knows more about wastewater management than Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court does, or fucking Marco Rubio in the legislature does. So we should probably defer to them because it's their job to know about it. And obviously they will work in concert with the private enterprises that are going to be affected, because obviously those enterprises should have an amount of knowledge about these things as well. The thing is, we have historical precedent and evidence that they did and didn't do anything about it because it would hurt their profit margin to save people's lives and make it so that we don't live in Fallout New Vegas. So that's how that could be bastardized. So the Chevron doctrine can actually be helpful to governmental organizations when it comes to regulating a variety of industries, but if it's used by conservative activist judges in this way, it's beneficial to the industry. And it's also just being chipped away at as well, because of the Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo case. A lot of that is also the micromanaging questions doctrine. When it comes to that micromanaging aspect of like Clarence Thomas or Brett Kavanaugh or Amy Coney Barrett probably don't know as much about wastewater management as the EPA probably does. So we should probably leave it up to them to figure that out. And if, those people in the EPA, well, they're not democratically elected by the people directly, but they're appointed by the president. So, there's a little bit of a democracy going on there. If that's the argument we're making, it should work in that way, but they're trying to make it so that it doesn't. And that could be applied to a variety of things. You could easily make arguments, especially when it comes to the political contention aspect of the major questions doctrine, when it comes to regulating firearms. Oh, well, there's a lot of political contention from the Republican Party about if people who have literally been found by courts to be a danger to themselves and people around them, well, maybe those people shouldn't be allowed access to firearms because they're more likely to end up using those firearms to hurt themselves or others, right? And it is quite literally the case. Studies have shown that 60% of mass shootings, the perpetrator has a history of domestic violence. So theoretically, if you have been proven by a court to be a domestic abuser, it might be better for not even just the direct people involved when it comes to, any kind of domestics happening between people in a household, but also because these mass shooters tend to go out and do a little bit more than just being in the house. Maybe making it so that those people can't get guns might decrease the likelihood of mass shootings happening. Maybe. I don't know. It's just a hunch I have. But you could be like, oh, well, there's a lot of political contention. The Republican Party's got a lot of thoughts about this. We should probably just leave it up to the gun manufacturers in the industry. And there you go. Nothing changes because it would hurt the gun manufacturers' bottom line. Bada bing, bada boom. Nothing good could ever happen. So it's important that you know about a lot of this, and you should definitely watch this video as well. It's important that you know a lot about this because I hear a lot about how, oh, well, voting doesn't matter. If voting mattered, then why aren't they trying to make it illegal? And it's like, I get where your agony is coming from when it comes to your feeling that your participation in the electoral process doesn't mean a whole lot. But the reason why you have that feeling is not just because the Democrats are dog shit, and they are, but because it has been a long-term historical project of the conservative ideological movement in this country and the Republican Party to make it so that your participation in the electoral process doesn't do anything, right? Through gerrymandering, through voter suppression, through participation trophies like the Electoral College, through weaponizing the judiciary and packing it with conservative activist judges so that even if your vote does end up getting Joe Brandon elected, well, they can just strike down any good shit that he's trying to do by calling it unconstitutional because of the major questions doctrine, right? So they quite literally are trying to make it harder for you to vote, which is an indication that it's probably a good idea to do it. Historically speaking, the higher voter turnout is, the more people that vote, the more likely it is a Democrat wins. The lower voter turnout is, the more likely it is Republicans are to win. Now, getting a Democrat in a seat of power is not the be-all end-all of political engagement. In fact, I would wager casting a ballot is the bare minimum civic engagement, and you should be doing more in your communities, in your workplaces, when it comes to organizing, because that's the only way real change has ever been made, is through on-the-ground work of people standing in solidarity with each other, especially when it comes to things like the rise in unionization we're seeing and the rise in striking and pro-labor sentiment we're seeing. A lot of that is happening because of a funny little Jewish man from Vermont ran for office for the presidency against Hillary Rodham Clinton, more like Hillary Hussein Clinton, and pushed a lot of these ideas into the broader zeitgeist, and even pushed a variety of people to run themselves in the Democratic Party and win and actually stand for those ideals and make those changes in local and state elections and are attempting to do it federally. Not only this, but even some more centrist and liberal Democrats are having to move further left, at least in rhetoric, pretending to be for some things, or in some cases actually being for it, because of that. And that was just one funny little man's with the funny hair and the funny hand movements run for the presidency. Just a silly little guy with a dream. So clearly voting is worthwhile. It's not the be-all end-all, but you should be doing it. You got to vote for the best option in the Democratic primary, and then vote for the least bad option in the general, which is always the Democrat. Until we can move to a proportional voting system, those are your two options. And it's a fucked up situation that both parties benefit from. So both of them are hesitant to change it. Now, more progressive Democrats are going to be more likely to change it, so getting them into a seat of power is very important. But until we can do that, the most we can do is at least get milquetoast Joe Brandon in power, who's actually been better than the Obama administration, and just stop the bleeding until people on the ground can make shit happen. You know, I'd rather have a party in the seat of power that's at least willing to acknowledge that we're rocketing toward a cliff and to maybe take their foot off the gas and apply a little bit of a pressure to the brakes, than allow a party to gain power who has literally put their foot through the floor and are fucking yabba dabba doing their way off that goddamn cliff in the Republican Party. It's an unfortunate reality that we live in, but it's one we live in. I don't like it. I hate talking about it, but it's important. Reason I bring all that up, obviously, is because if we have more Democrats in a seat of power, especially ideally further left ones, then they go on to nominate judges in all of the circuit courts, in all of the state courts, and eventually the Supreme Court through the presidential seat. And that essentially makes this project by the Republican Party to undo our democracy and just rule by decree through the grand wizards of the Supreme Court less effective. And it's important we do that because otherwise we're all well and truly fucked. And sure, on-the-ground organizing can help stop a lot of the bleeding, but it's going to be a lot of blood. Just, electoralism isn't going to be enough to stop it, never has been. And just on-the-ground organizing currently, given our current conditions, it's getting better because of the amounts of unionizing, the pro-labor sentiment, and the solidarity that's being built within individuals, and the collectivizing, nature of that idea. There's a lot of ways that you can help influence politics through a union, which has got a lot of historical precedent before they were ruined by Republicans and some Democrat bullshit. But we're just not at the point where we can ignore the electoral system. And frankly, I don't know that we ever will be, unless we well and truly move to a stateless, classless, and moneyless society. But I don't know. I'm not seeing that in my lifetime. So the best I can do is advocate to stop the bleeding a little bit. Or at least try to recognize that there's a wound there and start making moves to try to start patching it up. But yeah, so I hope that you didn't fall asleep through all of that. I hope my wacky antics were able to keep your attention. It's very important. Be good, be safe, have fun out there as much as you can. And yeah, good luck.